Hi, my name is Claus, and I have written a book on how to disengage from inner criticism. And to give you a little bit of an idea about what this book contains, I'm going to talk you through the table of content. So the book consists of 5 chapters, and in the first chapter, which is the introduction, I start by talking a little bit about what inner criticism is and how it develops. So these are one way of talking about inner criticism is that it's an internalization of the rules for living that we were exposed to in childhood, but it's also an internalization of how these rules for living were enforced. So the combination of these two is what the inner criticism is. And then I talk about why it's a good idea to disengage from inner criticism. Why isn't it fine to have inner criticism? Why should we disengage from it? And I mentioned 5 reasons, and these are not the only reasons there are. There are many other reasons, but these are like 5 important reasons. The first reason is, of course, that inner criticism can simply make you feel miserable. And it's quite nice to disengage from it for that reason alone. But there are also other reasons. For example, inner criticism will prevent you from refining your thinking and acting. It makes your mind too rigid, the inner criticism. It prevents you from playing around with things and challenging things, and in that way expand and refine your thinking and your acting. Sometimes it's also counterproductive, like inner criticism. Often you criticize yourself because you want to push yourself to do something. But when you do it by criticizing yourself, it often creates so much resistance and so many unintended byproducts that you end up not achieving what you were trying to do. So maybe you're criticizing yourself for being really lazy. And if you do that, well, you do that because you want yourself to be more productive. But the criticism then makes you sort of resisting being productive, or it takes away the energy that you need for being productive. So inner criticism can be counterproductive. Another reason for disengaging from inner criticism is that it blocks your creative imagination. So there are certain things that you cannot even think about, because even thinking about them would make you criticize yourself. And when you limit what you can think about, you also limit what you can create. So that's another reason. And then, of course, the final reason is that inner criticism is often paralyzing. This is one of the main things to notice about inner criticism, that it enforces rules, but it will often enforce conflicting rules. So basically, it's impossible to do the things that your inner criticism is trying to push you to do, because it will push you to do opposite things. It might tell you that you shouldn't ask a specific question, because it's a stupid question, but at the same time it tells you that you should ask that question, because if you don't, you're a coward. So you end up being paralyzed. The next thing is why do people not disengage from inner criticism? There are a couple of reasons. So one reason is that people think that their inner criticism is their conscience. It isn't. You have a true conscience, but inner criticism often isn't your conscience. It looks like it, but it isn't. And you can see that it isn't because it enforces conflicting rules. Now, your conscience can't enforce conflicting rules. That doesn't fit with most people's idea about what a conscience is. A conscience wouldn't tell people to do something and not do something. Another reason people don't disengage is because they think that the inner criticism is their only source of motivation. I have talked to so many people who say, I don't disengage from inner criticism because if I do, I wouldn't do anything. Also, not true. Inner criticism will more often than not prevent you from feeling motivated, will drain you from energy, and not be very productive or very motivated. And you have other sources of motivation. Sometimes you are motivated by pure enthusiasm, by the thrill of discovery. Those are the kinds of motivation. So don't worry, you can disengage from inner criticism without becoming a couch potato. Another reason would be that you think that inner criticism is the source of parental love. So you want to not disengage from inner criticism because you feel that if you do, you are not deserving of love. Again, not true, and I explain that in detail in this section. The final one is that some people feel that because a large part of the inner criticism was sort of inherited rules from your parents, then disengaging from inner criticism is somehow a betrayal of your parents. Again, it really isn't. Your parents would like to see you flourish, and if they wouldn't, you shouldn't mind betraying them. So yes, also not true. Throughout the book, there's a lot of reflection exercises. So almost every section ends with a question or a couple of questions to reflect on. And in this last chapter or last section of the introduction, I say a little bit about how it is good to do those reflections. So something like paying attention to your felt sense, what you feel in the body as you are reflecting, staying receptive while you are doing it, assuming that there are no inner enemies, a very important point I will return to again and again through the book. Looking at what came before every single time you notice something in your inner experience, noticing what is that a reaction to, something that can greatly empower your self-exploration. And then notice and savor the relief when you explore your inner experience and you discover new things about yourself. Sometimes it's a great relief to put words to those things. And when you feel such a relief, it's really good to say, okay, let's just pause and just enjoy this relief, because that has a very powerful healing effect on you. Then the second chapter, I talk about how to detect inner criticism. So I say a little more about why it can be difficult to detect. Some of the reasons are simply that inner criticism is so familiar, so you don't notice it because it's there all the time. Another reason is that it's very inconsistent. I mentioned that before. It can enforce different rules. So because it is both the thing that tells you to ask a question and to not ask a question, you go like, is that both inner criticism? Yes, both of those are inner criticism. Then it's constantly evolving. It picks up new ideas about what kind of rules it should be enforcing. Every single time you come into a new social circle or new social group, your inner criticism picks up new ideas from that group. So this constant evolution makes it more difficult to detect. Your inner criticism can appear as your own rational opinion. This is very common. You don't think that something is inner criticism. It feels like it is just your well thought out rational opinion. But those rational opinions are worth exploring in depth. Another reason is that it often feels instinctual. Sometimes it doesn't come with words. It doesn't come with formulated sentences. It is just like, it feels like an instinct. It just feels like, don't do that. That's just dangerous. You don't even know why. It's like you just feel like a tension in the belly or a tension in the heart. And that's all you know about it. And then lastly, inner criticism often creates a sense of urgency that makes you feel you have to do something now, and therefore you don't stop to reflect on it. So these are some of the reasons it can be difficult to detect. Next, I then talk about some of the main ways that you can actually detect inner criticism anyway. So one of them is that when these are all like signals, that when you feel these signals, you go like, I should pause and see, is there any inner criticism at work now? One of the signals would be that you feel certain deficiency emotions. Whenever you feel guilt or shame or small or cornered or deficient or something like this, chances are that there is some sort of inner criticism going on. Pause, figure out what it is. Another signal that inner criticism is at work is what I call deficiency motivations. Whenever you are engaged in some sort of action and you feel you need to do this because you are lacking in some way, also check. Is there inner criticism? If you feel I need to meditate more because I'm not kind enough, or I'm not compassionate enough, or I'm not strong enough, you see the criticism is already there. Then when other people's criticism really hit you, that might also be a sign that the way the other person is criticizing you, you are also criticizing yourself. That's why you have a sore spot there. Another one would be how you criticize other people. If you criticize other people for certain character traits or emotions or thoughts or actions, you're most likely to also criticize yourself for the same things. And the last signal is that sometimes there are certain emotions and thoughts and behaviors that are kind of conspicuously absent for you. You know other people have them, but you just seem to never have them. Then it's also very good to check, because often that is because you are very efficiently criticizing those things in yourself. In fact, you are so efficient that they are completely banned from your conscience. In chapter 3, I give a lot of ways in which you can describe the inner criticism and describe your reactions to this inner criticism. The reason it is important to describe inner criticism is because through describing it, one, you become more familiar with it and then it's easier to detect. And two, while you're describing something, you are not so taken by it. So by describing inner criticism, you are already starting to disengage, because instead of being in the midst of the drama, you are now looking at the drama and getting curious about the drama and getting curious about how you can describe it with precision. So the first section, I describe I describe how you can use journaling and in a structured way of journaling to describe inner criticism. And in the two following sections, I describe first the different voices the inner criticism can speak with. Sometimes inner criticism comes as self-judgment. Sometimes it comes like threats. It's like, if you keep doing that, this is the terrible consequences. And sometimes it comes with a cynicism, like a devaluation or a reduction of certain aspects in yourself or in the world. The last one can sometimes be tricky to detect, but it's very good to catch it. I also talk a little bit about how you can describe inner criticism more precisely, not just by talking about or describing what voice it speaks with, but also describing sort of the inner personality part that voice that criticism, because they can feel very different. And describing them is a way to sort of get to know them, get to meet them, and again, not be completely taken by them, neither being merged with them, nor feeling a victim of what they say. So this is very important. Then in the third section, I describe different ways of describing your own reactions to inner criticism. Sometimes you comply with it, sometimes you rebel against it, you combat it, and sometimes you collapse under it, or sometimes you do combinations of those things. The reason it is important to describe your reactions to inner criticism is because often your reactions to inner criticism is a type of counter-criticism. And so if you want to disengage from inner criticism, you have to disengage from both the criticism itself and from your reactions to it. You have to step outside or disengage from the entire system. Good. So in chapter 4, I go through 15 different paths of how to disengage. So one of them, the first one sounds kind of funny. It's like disengaging by not engaging. It is how you are able to sort of not get hooked into the whole drama. When you see it, you recognize it, you describe it, and you kind of sit back and go like, yeah, I'm not gonna get sucked into that. I don't want to comply with it, and I also don't want to combat it. And that's a very nice way of disengaging from the whole thing. Another one is to get really into the role of the researcher, the curious person. Again, as I mentioned before, while you are doing the research of your inner criticism, you are not hooked into it. Another one is to sort of compare the purpose and the effect of inner criticism. When you do that, you often become a little disillusioned with the inner criticism. Often when you don't disengage from it, it's because you think, well, it has a point, it has a good purpose. But when you see that the way it pushes you toward that purpose defeats that purpose, you start going, hang on a sec, and then you start disengaging from it. Another one is laughing at the absurdity of the inner criticism. It is often absurd. When you really describe it in detail, you see that it is wildly unrealistic, it is self-contradictory, it's got all the things that you would expect from a comic character. And it can be a great relief to recognize that. And the moment you recognize that, that's also something that really, in a powerful way, take you out of the whole drama of it and bring such a lightness and joy to your inner experience. The fifth path is owning back your strength. It's looking at the inner criticism and enjoying the vitality of it, because it's very vital. It's got a lot of energy. And if you focus on the energy rather than the content, you can get very vitalized, very energized from that. So these are the kind of 15 different paths. The reason I describe 15 different paths is because not every path is going to work for every single person. So I invite you to play around with some of the different paths, go through them one by one, and then find the one that really works for you, and then just use that. Or maybe you find 2 or 3 that really works for you. So yes. The fifth chapter is a chapter where I describe this disengaging from inner criticism as a spiritual path. I strongly believe that disengaging from inner criticism is not just something you do to feel a little bit better about yourself. It is something that fundamentally changes how your personality parts interact. It fundamentally changes your whole inner atmosphere and your whole inner system of different personality parts. And in a way, you can say it brings about this cultural change where each part of you gains much more compassion for the other parts, much more understanding for other parts, and start collaborating, working together. And in that way, I find disengaging from inner criticism can be a spiritual path in its own right. And I think it's a spiritual path that is very well suited for modern people because, well, a spiritual path should be one that has an initial attraction for people. And I think most people are attracted to the idea of disengaging from inner criticism. And in the end, I have 3 appendices that are sort of resources you can that can help you in your reflections. So because the exploration of physical felt sense plays a great part in this book, I have included a list of neutral sensory words that you can use to describe felt sense. Negative and positive character traits also play a great role in many of the reflection exercises. So I have also included 2 lists of negative and positive character traits to inspire you when you engage with those reflections. None of these 3 lists are complete, but they are quite comprehensive, so they should be a great assistance in your reflection exercises. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you will support the publication of this book by purchasing your copy here through Kickstarter.